All right, good day to everybody. This is the YouTube channel Faith Seeking Understanding. I am Alan Bevere. I'm a pastor and a professor, and I am a lover of baseball, and so is my guest today, Scot McKnight. Scott, are we going to be sitting in the stands this summer, you think? Or
I think we will eventually, but
yeah,
my son was in the Cubs organization for 20 years,
yeah,
and he resigned, and he's now working for an analytics company.
yeah.
This is no kidding. They put a helmet on someone and they watch the pitchers in the major leagues so that you can practice batting against that pitcher
Wow.
it's something that fits on the helmet in the head. So you're watching Trevor Bauer pitch.
Yeah, that's
And now
amazing.
they're designing a bat that you swing,
Yeah.
and it will tell you your contact on the ball that Trevor Bauer threw.
Oh man,
Yeah,
unbelievable.
that's pretty cool, isn't it?
It is. Well, I'm hoping we'll get
Yeah.
to see some baseball up close and
I
personal.
do.
That's
I
that's
think
one of
it'll
the
happen. I
yeah,
think
it's one
we'll
of
be
the
in the
great joys of
stands.
my summers, and I didn't get it last year. So,
Yeah.
oh well. So anyway, Scott, we're going to be talking about your book, A Church Called Tove. So as we get into that first thing, tell us a little something about yourself.
Well, everybody should know that I know Alan because both of us did our PhDs with the eminent and illustrious James D.G. Dunn.
Yeah.
So we've been friends probably longer than either of us care to admit.
Yeah, it's been many years. Yeah.
I realized I was writing someone this morning. I realized I began my PhD 40 years ago.
Yeah.
So, but I grew up in the Midwest, Northwest Illinois. My father was a high school teacher. My wife's father was a high school teacher at the same school. So Chris and I grew up together, and then finished college. Did a seminary degree at Trinity.
Hmm.
Then we packed up our bags with our two children and moved to Nottingham, England. And I worked with Jimmy Dunn before Alan Bevere did. And then I've been teaching as a professor for almost, going on 37, 38 years, something
Wow.
like that.
Mm.
This is my third institution, Northern Seminary. It's a Baptist seminary. We have no full-time Baptist professors. I'm an Anglican. We have Reformed, Christian Missionary Alliance, Methodist. So we're all over the map, and we're not really a Baptist seminary in that sense.
Hmm.
We are ecumenical, and we welcome all. And I serve in an Anglican church as a deacon, and I preach and I write, and I'm a professor. Chris is a psychologist. Our two children, one of us is an adult, they're both adults teaching one public school, and the other one involved in baseball analytics and technology.
Excellent.
You want
Excellent.
more?
No, that is really, really good. And as you're saying, you started your work with Jimmy 40 years ago. I was just doing some math in my head. I started mine. It'll be 30 years ago this year. Yeah.
Wow.
So
Wow.
time moves on. Anyway.
Oh, I know. I mean, and with Jimmy passing this year,
Yeah.
it's sad, but he had such an impact on so many. And I bump into people all the time who are in our circle of professors. So it's pretty
Yeah.
neat. It's pretty neat. We have been blessed, and
We have been. It was a joy to work with him and study with him. And I like to tell the story as I was putting my dissertation together for its final thing, and I just apparently wasn't getting what Jimmy was trying to help me out with. And I had a conversation with him on the phone one day because I was back here in the United States, and he was real tough on me. And he finally said, I don't understand why you're just not getting this. And it really put the fear of God into me. And of course, I got my PhD, but I look back on some of that and think that because of his not only often wise counsel, but sometimes his tough counsel. It was good.
Yeah.
You know, his job wasn't to hold my hand. His job was to make sure I produced something that would be acceptable. So
yeah, and it's not just what he thinks. He knows there's going to be an external examiner.
Absolutely.
And I remember I sent him a paper. He asked me for a paper on gospel methodology, and I sent him a paper. And I was in his living room because at the time we were living in Cambridge and he was at Nottingham teaching at Durham.
Yeah.
And oh, did he push me hard. And I got back on the train and went to Cambridge and just wondered if I should just get off the train, pack up the bags and go home. So I called him the next day and he said, you know, I've never treated another student like this, but he said, I think I did it because I think you can handle it. And he said, I was harder than I needed to be, but there's some things you need to think about. And from that point on, you know, it was really, well, I was only his fourth student. So, so you were
no, I got the more seasoned Jimmy Dunn, but but nevertheless, I always think about that, and it was instructive for me. You know, as we have then advised students that, you know, we're not there to set them up with kind words to fail necessarily. So anyway, we need to get into the book. We could reminisce all day, but by the way, before we get into the book per se, tell me a little bit about Laura Behringer. She's got an author line here in this book, and I would hate not to at least make some recognition of her.
Laura Behringer is my daughter.
I didn't realize that. Do you say that in the book?
It's Laura mentions it, I think, in the first chapter.
I missed that.
She and I wrote a book for children. She wrote it.
Okay.
And it was Laura McKnight Behringer, but Tyndale took her middle name, took McKnight out of it.
Okay.
And Laura takes it as a great badge of honor when people wonder how she got involved in the book.
Okay. Well, now that I'm looking at her picture on the jacket, I can see her mother. I didn't notice that at first. Well, how great is that to have your daughter work with you on this project?
Well, here, I mean, she's. I would never have been involved in this book had she not been so persistent. In she and her husband were very much involved at Willow Creek. And really struggled with what happened with people who struggled with what happened. And were pretty hard on her. And I would say to her, this is what you need to say. This is what's going on. This is a misinterpretation of scripture, etc. And so after a while, she said, Dad, you need to put some of these things together because the people aren't hearing this. So it became my first blog post, which put me in the orbit of this conversation about Willow Creek. Was that blog post. So, but she was very persistent, and Alan, she found most of the stories. And some of the other details, and then she edited what I wrote, and then I edited what she wrote, and it's very much a joint project.
Excellent.
She had contributions on nearly every chapter. I mean, every paragraph.
Well, I'm glad I asked that question. I'm glad to know that. So let's begin with the book, Church Called Tove, and you sort of broached it just a little bit there. Why did you write this book?
Well, Alan, I'm a professor. By the way,
let me show it here so people can see it. A Church Called Tove. All right, there you go. All right, now why did you write the book?
Well, I teach in a seminary. We went to Willow Creek for 10 years. Laura and Mark went to Willow Creek for 20 years. Mark was on staff there. Willow Creek had a big influence in our life, and we care about Willow Creek. But we didn't write this book for Willow Creek or simply because of Willow Creek. We wrote it because of what happened at Willow Harvest Chapel, which is another church in Chicagoland, the Southern Baptist churches, the Roman Catholic churches, Sovereign Grace, these churches where pastors are collapsing. And when the curtain is pulled back, we're discovering all kinds of toxicity. So I had students asking me, I'll never forget the day a student calls me and says, point blank, Scott, what can I do now so that I don't become James McDonald later? And Alan, this was a really big question for me. And I began to talk about this in class. And I would talk about culture that was forming in churches and that leaders have an impact on culture. That behind culture is character. You know, you've heard this line from Peter Drucker that strategy eats, culture eats strategy for breakfast. Yeah. My line is character eats culture and strategy for breakfast. Right. So our character matters. So I wanted to work on what are the characteristics of a good culture. And I started using the word goodness, and pastors and friends said, man, that's a great word. So I started studying Tove in the Hebrew Bible, which occurs so often. It's a master moral category.
Yeah.
And I said, that's what we're going to do. We're going to use Tove as our arch category and mark out characteristics of Tove that will help form churches that won't abuse women, children, boys, others, and won't have power mongering abuse and authority abuse, and will not be comfortable with a narcissistic type leader. So we started working on those topics. And frankly, the 7 characteristics that we found of Tove that we sketch are mapped onto characteristics of toxicity in churches.
Yeah.
So we didn't just sit down with the fruit of the Spirit or the Beatitudes and say, this is what you need. And that's a little bit artificial. We wanted to dig down a little bit and what are the characteristics of toxicity in churches?
Yeah.
And then what's the biblical antidote? So we wrote that way. We wrote it that way, but I told Laura, I have other things I'm working on. I don't need to do this. But Alan, this is the strangest thing for me. I had a revelatory moment reading, of all things, a book about how the German pastors responded to the Holocaust.
Yeah.
And I thought, this is how pastors respond when allegations come forward. And I started marking down characteristics. How do they respond? And I found so many parallels that I began to explore from that point on, thinking, I think I found an idea. And I told Laura this over on a Christmas vacation trip. We were with them. I said, I think I've found some categories that are worthy of writing about. And it turned into a chapter we call false narratives. So, Alan, that's sort of the background of why we wrote it.
Okay. So so a couple things interested me. Let me just, for those who haven't read the book, and I'm hoping what will result in this is that there will be people who will get this book, including, and pastors. Some of my colleagues need to read this book. But you talk about Tove churches, good churches, nurture culture that includes empathy, grace, people first, truth, justice, service, and Christ-likeness. And you have those in a circle, one leading into the other.
Yeah.
And go ahead. You look like you were going to say something.
I don't think I would. We messed with the order. I don't believe that the Christ-likeness is all 7 combined.
Yes.
But the first 2 are because we started as a result of our editor's suggestion of the 2 main characteristics of a toxic pastor and a toxic church culture: narcissism and power through fear. From that point on, we just, the next 4 are just sort of random.
Yeah. And
you can take them in order, but we call it the Circle of Tove. And these things are interlocking. You know, I told Laura, we're not going to use any pastors in churches that we know today as our examples, because that may turn out to be the wrong one. We used a dead man, Mr. Rogers, as our primary example.
Yeah.
And Alan, I've told people this: every church deserves a pastor with the character of Mr. Rogers. And I really believe that. I mean, none of us is perfect, and Mr. Rogers seemed to be a pretty nice guy.
Yeah.
But we need people like this in our churches instead of our images of success as big churches and lots of money and handsome and beautiful wives and, children going to Harvard. Instead of using that as our image of a pastor, we want to use the image of someone, Jesus is the ultimate model. Paul's not bad, but we used Mr. Rogers. I was quite impressed with him.
Yeah, so let's talk. So a couple of things. Let's first talk about the issue of character, which I really much appreciated your emphasis on that. I studied with Stanley Hauerwas, so I've got character emblazoned on my brain and virtue and the importance of that. But we do seem to have bought into the idea, and I mean maybe this goes along with what you're talking about in reference to the churches and how the churches view themselves. We seem to have bought into the idea that what's really important with our leaders is not so much that they're people of upstanding moral character, although we don't want them to be, really bad, but we want them to, we're more interested in how they function. We're more interested in their effectiveness. So we're willing to put a little bit of character to the side if you've got a pastor who, say, brings young families in or grows the church budget. And so we are willing to excuse some bad behavior at times. Is that a fair comment or not?
Oh, sometimes I think we do this far more often than we should be doing.
Yeah.
And it is true. Look, a lot of churches succeed. I mean, they won't succeed if they don't have a certain amount of budget.
Right.
To get a certain amount of budget, you got a certain number of butts in the seats. All right. To get that many butts in the seats, you got to have this kind of charismatic personality when you preach on Sunday morning. Now, all of a sudden, what really matters is the budget rather than character. And I think that everybody is to blame.
Yeah.
I think churches are to blame. I think seminary professors are to blame. I think the pastors are to blame. The lay people are. We just have created a system that is not conducive to valuing character.
Yeah.
And yet, Alan, all of us know this. When we meet someone who is Tove to the core, we say, now that's what we need as an example. Yeah. And I think we should focus a lot more on that. I put pressure on myself as a seminary professor to work with students in this way, but I have some of them for 1 year, some of them for off and on for 3 or 4 years. And this is a lifelong process of character formation. And we need to value that. Now, the other side of this, Alan, and I know you know about this because of your excellent work on ethics, but the ancient world learned ethics by emulation, not by information and instruction. Now, yes, there was instruction, but the key is you wanted to be like that teacher.
Right.
So the disciples of Jesus wanted to be with him. This is what Mark tells us right away. Matthew does too. They wanted to be with him. And Paul has got the guts to say, imitate me, copy me, follow me, do it the way I do it as I follow Christ. And you got to think that people thought John was pretty cool when he's always talking about love and, love does this, and couldn't create a sentence on his Apple computer without the word. Every time he hit period, the word love appeared next, and he had to create another sentence. So I think emulation is something we need to value more and say to our students, do people want to be like you?
Yeah.
When I get, Alan, I know you get this kind of question a lot more than I do because of your position, but I'll have students several times a year say to me, do you think I should be a pastor? And I always ask them 2 questions. Who are you pastoring now? And who now sees you as the pastor? And they'll say, well, I'm not a pastor. I'll say, no, I want you to know something. Pastoring is not a job. Pastoring is a gift.
Mm-hmm.
Those who are pastors pastor people, and people see them as a pastor. Now, of course, if you're 19 years old and you just discovered your pastoral gift, you might not be pastoring. Although I do know college students do a lot of pastoring of one another. I experienced that. But at the age of the students that I see, this is a potent question. And then I always bring it back to you have to be the kind of character that people want to be like, and then they want you to be their pastor.
Yeah.
So I know you've got more to say about this than I do.
No, well, that's really good. I appreciate that. I wonder sometimes if we've created a monster that's just difficult now to get our arms around in tame, because when you talked about the budgets, being a mainline pastor, we've got most of our churches are in decline overall in reference to numbers and things like that. And pastors are going now into churches where the building is a product of the heyday, right? When the rooms were full and money was coming in. And so they built these big buildings. And now the buildings are too large for the congregation, but they want to keep the building. So pastors are sent in, and we may pay lip service to what you've just said about the problem, but when it comes to actually performing, what we really end up defaulting to is focusing back on the problems that are not necessarily going to help nurture the church toward a Tove congregation.
Yeah. I mean, you end up trapped.
Yeah.
We've got to have enough money to pay for this building. That means enough butts in the seats. We got to have the kind of person that can attract butts in the seats, keep them there, and keep their pocketbook loose.
Yep.
In that pocket. And this is not conducive to Christian discipleship.
Right.
In our day. Look, it's not just main lines that are declining. And the evangelical church can say all it wants, but it's not doing so well either.
Yeah.
So the non-denominational churches, some of them are growing like crazy. Of course, they've got dynamic teachers that entertain everybody on Sundays, but it's time for all of us to sit back and to begin to think, what's it going to take to be a pastor in this congregation for 10 years? What kind of character? We, both of us studied in England. Those churches are struggling a lot more even than the United States.
Yeah.
And this is the same thing I hear from them. It's about character.
It's about character. I've said, I'm in my 36th year of pastoral ministry. I've said that if I could do it again, and I can't, and that's okay, but if I could do it again, I would probably want to found a congregation and rent some empty storefront in downtown, and have a congregation right there in the midst of the crossroads, and just pay rent, and as opposed to having to always focus on making sure that we pay the utilities.
You're not the first one that said this to me.
Yeah,
I've heard this a number of times. And here our small congregation just bought a building.
Yeah.
And we're doing well. It's not a problem. But the heyday when money was easier, more people were living in those neighborhoods where those churches were built. Those days are gone, and we have skeletons, we have structures that we'd love to preserve. They're beautiful. The good people of God paid for those things, and we don't want to just knock them down and give them away, but it's really hard, and I feel bad for the young pastors who are trying to make it work, and let's pray that there's some kind of revival and resurgence of interest in the church.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, we certainly hope so. I do. I feel for my young colleagues because they're facing challenges. When I was first starting out, we had the same challenges, but there were still enough money coming in and enough people in the pews that we could ignore it. Right? Now we can't. because it's there. So I want to talk about what a Tove church, how a Tove church looks. And by the way, let me state for the record that I'm very blessed right now because I serve a church that I think is a Tove church.
Oh, that's great.
I cannot say that throughout my ministry completely. I will not name names. A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. But right now, I am blessed with a Tove church. So I want to say that. So why are we, so before we get into the Tove, let's talk toxic. What attracts people to narcissistic leaders?
Well, this is a $1 billion question. I believe that narcissistic personality types love power and authority and glory. Chuck DeGroat has just written a book called When Narcissism Comes to Church. And one of the things he said the other day to me is that grandiosity is a characteristic of narcissists. And he said this, he said, let's face it, Scott, you and I, professors, and we preach, you can't really get up on that platform and not have a little bit of that in you.
Yeah.
I mean, you're a bit of a performer. And I went, okay, all right. I'm not a pastor, but yes, okay. But so it's not an either or, but I do believe that positions of power attract people who want power. Positions of glory attract people who are narcissistic and who love glory. And when you get the right combination, it just explodes. But by and large, it's a character fault of a person rather than the church's fault. The church may have lacked discernment to see a narcissistic personality and not hire him. But it's a character. It's a bad character problem that then explodes into full flame in certain churches. And I think it's the position of power and authority that attracts these people. And let's face it, a lot of them are driven. They have ambition. They love to work, and they'll get butts in the seats. Mm-hmm. And so before long, you've got a power-mongering, narcissistic leader who behind curtains and closed doors is mean as a snake and on the pulpit sounds perfect, who at home is violent with children and spouses. It's just really sad. And we need to have some discernment to recognize this in people.
Where does the role of psychology and psychological testing come in here? I know as a Methodist pastor, you do not get approved for any kind of ministry without the whole battery of psychological tests. And I know that is not the be all end all, but what about as one of the requirements in reference to pastors, in reference to whether we even accept someone to be a pastor, is to have them subject themselves to these batteries of tests that might indicate.
Okay. Did you take any at Duke?
I took it years ago when I entered in. Yeah. A whole battery was there all day. We do it now.
Okay. At Duke? Is it, or was
no,
it
it's
just
with
in the
every
Methodist
conference.
Well, I totally believe in this. My wife's a psychologist. So Alan, the Methodist Church is doing it right on that. Now, it's not going to weed out them all, but it should, if they did you take the MMPI?
Uh-huh.
Yeah. I mean, the MMPI is going to get some pretty significant results.
Yeah.
They use the Myers-Briggs and stuff like that. That's like playing wiffle ball when you can play hardball.
Yeah.
And so I believe this is important. And I'm firmly committed to the importance of that for a denomination like the Methodists, and that they're wise. The non-denominational churches don't have this as a general rule. And they are also unaccountable to, aren't you a bishop? To bishops like Alan Bevere.
Yeah, I mean,
they're on their own. So we have a double whammy possibility in non-denominational churches who neither test candidates with a psychological profile, nor have any accountability. They can claim all they want for elders and deacons. They're almost never powerful enough and astute enough in theology or charismatic enough to defeat the powerful pastor.
Yeah.
So I'm with you. I think you guys are doing it right, and I want to commend you for it. It has to be done.
Yeah, we've done that for years, for 30 years. The other thing I was going to say to you that I can remember as I was reading your first section of the book in reference to some of the toxic stuff going on at certain churches, that I can remember 25 years ago, our conference was putting in place a sexual harassment policy. And so there was accountability there. But I will also say, and that's why I really wanted to probe this a little bit with you, because in my experience teaching as an adjunct, the stories I've heard from students who came out of abusive church situations, I want to say 8 out of 10 times it was a non-denominational independent church.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Well, I think I gave some of the things that I think about that as to why that's happening is that there's no accountability.
Right.
And there's no testing. Well, okay, they can bring people in, but they don't have the character that is needed. 9 times out of 10,
I'd say 8 out of 10. You know, I didn't actually.
I'm impressed.
I should have kept a record, but I over the years as I heard these stories, it just was more often than not, these were independent churches, non-denominational churches. And it was real clear. There was no accountability. The pastor, and it was exclusively male. It was the pastor, and the pastor had the board or whatever folks in leadership he surrounded himself with, and you were telling stories about this. You know, they had surrounded themselves with people who were just going to, say yes to whatever.
Yeah. Oh, Alan, this is. I think this is insightful for me. I'm so glad you brought this up because I had never thought about it that way. I guess I could have guessed someone would have asked me, but at least the majority of these problems that you're seeing are people who are in independent churches. Yeah. This is another reason to be involved in a denomination, another reason to take the MMPI, and to have this follow you as you go along in your career.
Well, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
You know, that now let's just say that it's not impossible for an independent church to put these things in place. You know, you can get a pastor who is a person of high character who wants to be accountable and can say, I want to put things in place to be accountable. And even in an independent church can begin to create that kind of culture, right?
Yeah, I believe it. But just think about it this way, Alan. When you are in an independent church, let's just say you're at Ashland Community Church. We'll call it that. Is there a church like that in Ashland?
We've got churches like that. I don't know if that's the name or not.
Okay, so I'm not talking about any community church.
Yeah,
okay. Ashland Community Church is calling a pastor. They're going to get names of recommendations from people. They don't have a denominational authority who knows, a leader who knows this pastor, who has seen the results of the MMPI. And if you bring someone in, you can't ask them to go through 8 hours of psychological exams and evaluation in the process of vetting candidates. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah.
So this is something that falls to the wayside, and it's very problematic. You know, we don't do this at a seminary either. We don't have to have an MMPI to get hired at Northern Seminary. I imagine most seminaries don't have that.
Probably not.
I've never heard of one that does, or a Christian college.
Yeah.
So we're reaping the whirlwind on this.
Yeah. So a church takes a pastor who's the narcissist, misses the signs. It can be easy to miss, particularly if you don't know a lot about the person. But then after a while, it becomes clear. We've got a toxic culture going on. What is it that keeps a certain percentage of people in that church on the pastor's side and support the pastor?
Oh, well, number one, they probably have benefited spiritually. They've grown. They've enjoyed the sermons.
Mm-hmm.
They baptized their children. They married their adult children. They buried their grandfather, or they buried their family member. I mean, there have been a lot of things that pastor has done for them. And the church is successful in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
Furthermore, a church is not simply a place we go, but it becomes a network to the point that it becomes a family.
Yeah.
I mean, when we were in Florida for 3 weeks, it was very pleasant to be in some nice weather.
Yeah.
And we missed the people. We missed the people at our church. We miss getting together with the people at our church on every other week. I think that's how often it is. We get together with our small group on Zoom.
Yeah.
And because we know one another, and we can't touch one another, but we see one another's faces and we know one another, we are in contact. We miss these people. That's another reason they stay.
Yeah.
And it's disruptive and it's painful to get rid of a pastor. It's going to cause division. People are going to get angry. Some people are going to leave. The church budget is going to be an impact. All those things keep those sorts of people there.
Yeah.
None of which are the best of reasons to keep pastors around, although the network is important. You don't want to leave, but it's churches are a complicated, complex, glorious, connected family.
Yeah.
And that's what it should be. But it also means it's not going to change quickly and easily without disruption.
I read somewhere, and I can't even think now, it was a long time ago, but this was suggesting that to change a culture of a church, it takes approximately 10 years. Do you think that's fair?
Alan, this summer in I think it was a D-Min course, I had a student in the class who, I don't know why he was in the class, he did a PhD in organizational transformation.
Mm.
And Tove came up, and I explained what this book is about. And this guy just sat there. He hadn't said that much. He had talked, but I didn't know what he had done. And at the end, he says, Scott, he said, I did a PhD in this topic. And I said, what do you think of my ideas? And he said something like this: they're pretty good ideas, but you aren't using the right terms. I said, what terms are you talking about? So he started using organizational transformation terms. And he started talking about the theory of changing cultures. And then he said, and I want you to understand this, in organizational transformation studies, we say it takes 7 years to change an organization's culture if the whole culture is committed to change. So
Yep.
10 years allows for a lot of Augustinian sinfulness to take root and fight the change.
Yeah.
Is it okay to use Augustinian with a Wesleyan?
It is okay, I say, but being a Wesleyan, we do have that we do believe in the spirit and transformation too. So let me throw you a conundrum.
Alan, that was exactly my response to student. I said, well, we've got grace and the Holy Spirit on
got the
our
Holy
side.
Spirit. I mean,
He said, okay, 6 years.
Yeah. I always bristle a little bit when I say, look, we got the sin part. We know that, and that's clear, but I think the Spirit works. We think the Spirit moves. So the other thing I was thinking as I was reading through your book, and again, this is a mainline independent church difference, is of course the pastor can stay too long in a congregation. And I think everybody would agree that sometimes a pastor who's been somewhere for 30 years can be too long and can develop some bad habits and some things that lead to toxicity in culture. But in our context, where I have a bishop who appoints, we have pastors who move long before, and here what I'm thinking of is the good pastors, the pastors who are capable of working toward creating this Tove culture or helping to encourage this Tove culture. And they're there 5 years, 6 years, and they get moved.
Yeah.
And there goes that. And so we don't have that many church pastors. We get pastors who are in churches 10, 11, 12 years, but that is probably less common. Very, very seldom do we get a pastor who's in a church for 20 years. That can happen, but it's really rare. So, how can a church that's struggling with its culture, and maybe not completely toxic, but have enough toxicity that changes really need to be made, how can you do that in a church where pastoral leadership is going to change 5 to 6 years?
Well, I also want to say that the shifting, and I've never been a fan of this Methodist style, but I've heard some pretty good defenses, including some from you at dinners with Nottingham students. Yeah. But I think there's some wisdom in not allowing a pastor to take so deep a root that it becomes a pastor-centered church.
Yes, I agree.
So that this keeps a pastor from becoming the focus of the church. That's a good thing. The other side of it is that in our book, we talk about cultures as agents. A church, let's just say a church, just look at the ground level, the people of the church are acting, and they act up. And before long, all their actions almost form into a personality, an agent, and that agent moves back down and starts to influence in them so much that they all start to fit in. David Brooks' famous statement that never underestimate the power of an environment to make you the kind of person that works in that environment.
Right.
But at the same time, there's another circle that we talk about. Leaders, if we talk at the top of a circle, influencing through their teachings, narrative, et cetera, personality, the congregation then can influence the pastor. And so it can become a circle of cultural influence. If you keep removing the pastors, there is a greater likelihood that the culture is determined by the congregation. Now you have a good analytical tool to say, look, you've only had this pastor for 3 years and that pastor for 4 and this pastor for 2. The only thing that hasn't changed is you folks. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about that. So I think that the Methodists have a particularly good opportunity to talk about Tove culture formed by congregations, shaped by congregations.
Yeah, and in our history, that was, the congregations basically handled the old circuit riding preachers. I mean, the preacher shows up once a month to do baptisms and weddings and funerals and lead some worship. But the weekly duties were the congregation and the lay leader who basically was in charge. And so the one thing I have defended itineracy in that it does help to prevent against this embedded pastor-centered church.
Yeah.
But it also sometimes doesn't allow a good pastor to lead the kind of change that can have a lasting impact if that pastor is moved too soon. That's always been my concern.
Yeah, well, I would agree with that. And that's why nurturing discipleship in a congregation is even more vital for a Methodist church.
Yeah.
But I'm more nervous today, I'll be honest with you, about these charismatic pastors who create pastor-centric churches. Yeah. And look, this is, I don't know what the story is in a Methodist church, but it's routine said at our seminary that when a pastor leaves, you can count on 25% of the congregation leaving.
Yeah.
Just because of that pastor.
Mm-hmm.
All right. I would hope in a Methodist church, because there's been more turnover, that would not be the same kind of number. But I don't know.
Our situation, I think it's all different. But I would say this, that if you have a pastor at a Methodist church, let's use the year 7. It's been 7 years. if that person has been pretty charismatic and pretty diverse, then it will be a problem for the next person, even in 7 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's a problem no matter what. Yeah. It's kind of interesting to think about the differences. So Scott, I don't want to, we can't end this without talking. What's a Tove culture look like in a church?
Well, to me, I would summarize it with one word: Christ-likeness. There's a sense that Jesus is at work, that people are going to encounter Jesus in this church. But our characteristics are: a Tove church has empathy, and an empathic person feels the pain with other people. So it has sympathy and empathy. It nurtures grace, and grace understood in the great categories of John Barclay's new book, the Paul and the Gift, where it's multiple. It's not just, God loves me and I'm a sinner and I deserve to go to hell. And I'm just plain lucky to be one of the elect. Although if I'm a Methodist, I better hang on. But grace is the power of God's culture, the power of God's presence to transform us and to make us the kind of person we should be. It puts people first. Alan, your congregation, your people value that you know their name. This is what it's about. I remember telling a student many years ago, who's a student teacher, he said, the student in the front row hates me. I said, how do you know? He said, he doesn't like anything I say. And I said to him, what's his name? He said, I have no idea. I said, okay, you learn his name and here's your responsibility. You go out, you get out the door when the students are coming into class, and when that student comes in, you greet him by name. And you come back to me in 2 weeks and tell me what it's like. Well, he didn't come back in 2 weeks. I saw him about a month later. I said, how's class? He said, great. I said, how's that student? Oh, yeah. He said, we've become friends.
Yeah.
And he learned his name. I mean, we need to put people first. And I don't think I am great at this, but I know that students value when I know their name or remember their paper or remember something that they did 3 years ago. And I'm not as good at this as I'd like to be, but I like my students. We tell the truth. A true culture doesn't lie. It doesn't spin false narratives. When someone got fired, you have to say they had to be released.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't have to say they were awful, but you don't say, the Lord called them somewhere else.
Yeah.
That's just spinning. And one of the big things for us is learning to resist false narratives. Yeah. We do the right thing. A Tove culture is about justice, but justice today is almost like a political statement. It means social justice. It means you're fighting in DC against Donald Trump or something like this. And in the Bible, justice is about the will of God revealed in the Torah of Moses, in the teachings of Jesus, life in the Spirit. And justice is doing that. It is doing the right thing at the right time. It also nurtures service. We have a tendency in churches to create celebrity cultures for pastors. Mm-hmm. This turns everything upside down. We don't have any celebrities. Jesus is the only celebrity. And we need to nurture that we are all servants. And I tell my students, you need to be involved in service in your church. And you can't tell anybody but your spouse. And maybe she goes with you or he goes with you. Don't do homeless feeding and then get up on Sunday morning and talk about homeless feeding. Now you're getting celebrity culture glory for service. And this is the opposite. It should attack our pride and, in a sense, push us down rather than make us glory. I used to always say this about Mother Teresa. She's famous for her work with the poor. Now, she really did work for the poor. So she's a great example, but not the problem. But I do think we have too much of a celebrity culture. To me, all of this is summarized that a Tove culture looks like Christ.
Yeah.
And it can say in the cheesiest of ways, what would Jesus do here? How do I discern as a follower of Jesus to live in this situation?
Yeah.
And the more we do that, the more we're going to build a Tove culture at church.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember many years ago in a previous church I served, somebody apparently had found out I had my PhD and came up to me one day after church and said, I didn't know you had a PhD. And I said, well, I didn't really know how to respond. And she said, well, why didn't I know this? I said, well, you never asked me. You know?
Well,
So,
it's good that you're not pumping it from the pulpit. I mean,
no, it's not.
I have students who get D-Mins and then they insist on being called
Yeah,
Dr. So-and-so. I think, no.
No. I'm Alan, Pastor Alan. I tell folks, call me what you want. And I said, I get names called behind my back. I'm sure that I said, so just call me whatever you want. But,
Yeah.
you know, some people feel the need to do that, and that's fine if that's how they feel. But, you know, I think we need to, I want to say too also in reference to some of these pastors to go back to what we were talking about, that I think there are pastors who go into this thing really, really wanting to serve, really wanting to be pastors, serve their congregations. And yet after a while, the pressure that's put on them to do all these things that we attribute to successful churches today can actually take them out of that what I would call a Tove posture.
Yeah.
Because the pressure is so great. We need to get young families again. We need to do this. We need to do that. We need youth. We're looking to the pastor. And by the way, you need to make sure you visit everybody. And so all this stuff's put on these pastors. So you get a pastor who comes into this with the best of intentions and with the best of motives. And over time, they get kind of pushed out of that because we've developed something that is just not something that is going to foster what you're arguing.
Yeah. No, I agree. And I do think that, Alan, I've met pastors who, and you know them more than I do, who the ministry would just wore them out.
Yeah.
It kind of broke them. And they just don't have the zeal for the Lord, and they're just kind of paying their dues and checking the clock.
Yeah.
And part of that is they didn't manage their heart, their life well.
Well, that's right.
Yeah. But it is a demanding job. And I think that the servant dimension of it can get lost in the leadership dimension of it, the fundraising dimension of it, the ambition of it. And we need more good bishops who can work with the pastors and say, you're doing fine. Just spend some time in prayer. You need a day off. That kind of pastoral work that they need as well.
So let me ask you one last question before we finish this. And again, appreciate your time. But I do have a fair amount of pastors who will be watching this. What would you like to say to them?
Alan, this is something I tell my students all the time. First of all, you're a Christian, not a pastor. Secondly, you need to be someone who prays. Mm-hmm. You need to nurture your relationship with the Lord. And I think if you keep these two things straight in front of you, it will help your marriage, your family, your church, and your ministry. So I would encourage people to, now that means reading their Bible too, Mm-hmm. I'm a Bible guy. But be a Christian. What does it mean to be a follower of Jesus? Mark Allen Powell wrote that great book, What Do They Hear? Pastors read the Gospels and identify with Jesus preaching to a congregation. The lay people read it. They identify with the disciples, hearing Jesus call them to live the way they should. Need to be disciples first rather than preachers first. So,
all right, Scott, I really appreciate that. Folks, this is the book, A Church Called Tove. And pastors, please get it, read it. It's really good. It's you'll find it to be very helpful for you. Scott, one thing I appreciate about you as a scholar is you are concerned about the pastors and writing for pastors. You know, as you and I both know, the scholarly guild writes often for itself, which is important. It's important the scholars talk. Yeah. But we, in my opinion, need more scholars who do what you do, who want to talk to the pastors and the folks in the pew in ways that are substantive and yet also clear and readable. So I appreciate
I appreciate you saying that. That's true. I care about pastors. I'm sad that this book had to be written because I wrote a book called Pastor Paul that's entirely positive, not critical. And there's negative stuff about pastors in this book, but I have constant admiration for the work that pastors do. Yeah. I know how hard it is. Yeah. And I want to be here to help you.
Well, you help us out. And by the way, speaking of Pastor Paul, I hope you'll sometime come back and talk to me about that book. I have to tell you a little story. When that book came out, I had to teach a course. It was a last minute thing, years ago, a last minute thing on Paul as pastor. So I was doing this thing on the fly, pulling stuff from everywhere I could get just to have some kind of semblance of a course. And I said to myself, someone needs to write a book about this. So you have delivered.
Well, you know, it's amazing how little I found about this.
Yeah.
And, you know, Jimmy says this, and so does Tom. I quote them both in the book, is that both of them say, we have to see him first as a pastor.
Yeah.
So very good.
All right. Friend, all right. Scott, thank you, my friend. And
thank you.
I don't know if you'll be in San Antonio in November or not, if we even have it there, but
planning.
But
that's a good place to have it.
It's a good place to have it. So, all right, folks, Scot McKnight, thanks, Scott, and we'll see you all again soon. Take care.
Thank you, Alan.